By the summer of 1944, Europe had entered a phase of the Second World War that would define the very shape of its modern history. Across vast swaths of French countryside, the thunder of Allied armor and the rumble of mechanized infantry heralded a movement unlike anything the continent had witnessed since the first days of Hitler's lightning campaigns. From Normandy's bocage to the roads of northern France, Allied troops pushed forward relentlessly. The D-Day landings of June had succeeded beyond expectation. Now every day mattered. Every mile gained was a push toward ending a war that had consumed 6 years of human life and reshaped global politics. From the east, the Soviet juggernaut advanced with brutal determination. From the Baltic to the Carpathians, Soviet armies moved in enormous columns, crushing German units that had been stretched thin, outflanked, and exhausted. Hitler's Eastern Front, once the pride of German military planning, was now a shattered line of retreating soldiers and burning equipment. With both the Western Allies and the Red Army closing in, Germany found itself in an unprecedented position, trapped, overstretched, and facing the impossible calculus of simultaneous collapse onto massive fronts. Yet the military picture was only part of the story. As Soviet troops crossed into Poland and beyond, they uncovered evidence of a darkness that went far beyond strategic defeat. Hidden in forests, in remote corners of cities, and in hastily camouflaged facilities were camps vast, industrialized centers of human suffering. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, and countless others revealed a machinery of death that was meticulous in its planning, horrifying in its scale, and unimaginable in its cruelty. Millions had perished before the Allies even arrived, and yet each liberated camp added weight to the staggering total, a total that forced soldiers, journalists, and governments to confront a moral abyss. For the advancing Allies, there was a dual sense of triumph and horror. On one hand, the liberation of territories occupied by the Nazis signaled the imminent collapse of the regime. On the other, the full scope of the Holocaust made clear that victory was not simply a matter of defeating armies. It was an ethical imperative to bear witness, to ensure that such crimes would never be repeated. Allied soldiers wrote home about emaciated survivors, about mountains of personal belongings stripped from the dead, about the industrial efficiency with which human lives had been extinguished. Every report, every photograph, every eyewitness testimony amplified the moral weight of their mission. The logistical challenges facing the Allies, however, were severe. As victorious columns pushed deeper into France, the supply lines stretched farther from the Normandy beaches, still partially under repair and vulnerable to German counterattacks. Every tank needed fuel, every truck needed tires, every soldier needed food and ammunition. The Red Ball Express, a network of trucks and drivers racing day and night, became a lifeline for the Allied advance. Thousands of men worked tirelessly, delivering the essentials across hundreds of miles of war-torn roads, ensuring that tanks could keep moving and infantry units remained supplied. Yet the gap between ambition and reality was stark. Victories on the map did not automatically translate into sustainable progress, and commanders had to balance speed with caution, momentum with prudence. In the West, the French countryside had been liberated village by village. The people of Normandy, Brittany, and the Loire Valley witnessed the liberation firsthand, seeing the Allied troops as both saviors and agents of a global effort that had taken on personal dimensions for millions. Resistance fighters, often small, poorly armed groups, joined in, sabotaging German positions, gathering intelligence, and guiding the Allied forces through landscapes they knew intimately. Their contribution, though less heralded in grand narratives of the war, was essential in maintaining momentum and weakening German positions from behind the lines. At the strategic level, the Allies faced pressing questions about how to continue the campaign. Every decision had consequences. A delay might allow German forces to regroup, yet an overzealous push could lead to overextended supply lines and catastrophic vulnerability. Churchill, Eisenhower, and Montgomery debated the pace of the advance, weighing the potential for rapid conquest against the risks of exhausting their forces. Hitler, meanwhile, desperate and increasingly irrational, sought technological miracle weapons and last-ditch counterattacks, but these were far from sufficient to alter the course of the war. The interplay between military advances and moral revelation defined the summer of 1944. Soldiers marching across France were not simply engaging enemy units. They were also walking through a landscape littered with the evidence of an ideology of hatred and extermination. Concentration camps, ghettos, and devastated villages testified to a regime willing to destroy humanity in pursuit of its vision. These discoveries reshaped the understanding of the war for leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike. The stakes were not only territorial or political, they were profoundly moral. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the human dimension. Ordinary soldiers, facing the exhaustion of constant marching and the stress of combat, encountered experiences they could scarcely have imagined. Survivors, freed from camps or forced labor sites, clung to life with a determination born of suffering and hope. Civilians returning to liberated villages experienced a mixture of relief, grief, and shock as they found neighbors missing or entire families destroyed. In the midst of strategic calculations and operational planning, the human toll of faces, stories, and memories of millions was an ever-present shadow. This was the context in which the Allies raced toward Paris. It was more than a contest of speed and force. It was a struggle against the consequences of the darkest excesses of the Nazi regime. Each mile gained symbolized not just military progress, but a moral reclamation, an attempt to restore humanity in lands that had endured unparalleled suffering. Victory was visible on the horizon, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the end of the war would reveal horrors that no military campaign alone could explain. As the summer advanced, the urgency of the moment became palpable. Commanders pressed their troops forward with an intensity born of both opportunity and necessity. Soldiers, mechanics, drivers, medics, and civilians all played their roles in this massive operation, often in overlapping, improvisational ways. The combination of strategic planning, human determination, and sheer logistical ingenuity defined the pace of the campaign and set the stage for the liberation of one of Europe's greatest cities, Paris. Before moving on to the next stage of this story, if you are enjoying this detailed dive into World War II history, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people discover these real, fascinating stories of the past. This is where segment 1 concludes, covering the dramatic convergence of military advance, logistical challenge, and moral reckoning in Europe during the summer of 1944. By early August 1944, the Allied advance across France had reached a crescendo. Months of planning, fighting, and sacrifice were about to culminate in one of the most iconic moments of the Second World War, the liberation of Paris. The French capital, under German occupation since June 1940, had endured for long years of repression. Streets that had once echoed with culture and commerce now bore the scars of oppression. Blackouts, curfews, propaganda, and the ever-present patrols of Nazi forces had shaped daily life into a tense, survival-oriented routine. Yet hope remained, fed by whispers of approaching Allied armies and by the courageous actions of the French resistance, which had steadily grown in strength and coordination. The liberation began not with a single, overwhelming assault, but with a combination of internal uprising and external pressure. In late August, the French resistance staged a series of coordinated strikes against German garrisons, cutting communications, blocking roads, and seizing key facilities. Paris, though geographically vulnerable, was politically and psychologically complex. The German commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, received orders from Hitler to destroy the city rather than surrender. The streets of Paris, in Hitler's vision, were to be reduced to rubble. A cultural annihilation meant to make the conquest of the Reich's enemies complete. Yet von Choltitz hesitated. Unlike many fanatical commanders, he recognized that the destruction of Paris would be irreversible, a historical crime even beyond the Reich's already catastrophic crimes. In a mixture of pragmatism, personal morality, and possibly exhaustion from years of war, he made the extraordinary decision to surrender the city largely intact. German troops maintained order only enough to avoid total chaos, allowing the Allies to enter the city with comparatively minimal urban combat. On August 25, 1944, Allied units, spearheaded by General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, rolled into Paris. Parisians, who had lived in fear for long years, erupted into celebration. Crowds thronged the boulevards, waving flags, singing, and embracing soldiers. The liberation was not only military but profoundly symbolic, a capital reborn, a morale boost for the Allies, and a demonstration that the Nazi regime's domination of Europe was slipping. Charles de Gaulle, head of the Free French forces, arrived to assert French sovereignty and leadership, declaring that Paris had reclaimed its freedom. Photographs of de Gaulle atop tanks, waving to jubilant crowds, became enduring symbols of national resilience and triumph. Yet the triumph in Paris masked the deeper realities of the campaign. East of the city, Allied units continued to push toward the German border, advancing hundreds of miles across French territory that had been scarred by retreating German forces. Roads were cratered or mined, bridges destroyed, and ports sabotaged. The Allies were victorious, but that victory came with a price: logistical complexity. The front lines had advanced faster than supply networks could accommodate. Every division required fuel, food, ammunition, and medical support, but the infrastructure necessary to deliver these essentials was often damaged or incomplete. The Red Ball Express became a lifeline, named for the red balls painted on vehicles to indicate priority shipments. This vast network of truck convoys operated continuously, 24 hours a day. African American drivers, often young men drafted from across the United States, braved poorly marked roads, mechanical failures, and sporadic German attacks to ensure that tanks rolled, guns fired, and soldiers ate. Each convoy represented an incredible feat of coordination and endurance. Yet even with thousands of trucks on the road, the sheer scale of the Allied advance meant that divisions often faced shortages. Fuel ran low, ammunition had to be rationed. Medical supplies lagged behind casualties. Victory was being achieved inch by inch, and every inch required painstaking effort. The strategic implications were clear: speed could not come at the cost of sustainability. Commanders debated the pace of the advance. Should armored divisions continue to push aggressively toward the Siegfried Line and beyond, risking overextension? Or should they consolidate gains, repair infrastructure, and ensure that the next phase of the war could be supported? These decisions had life or death consequences for soldiers and civilians alike. A delay might give German units time to regroup or lay mines, while reckless haste could see forward units stranded and isolated, vulnerable to counterattack. Meanwhile, the German forces, though retreating, were not yet defeated. Their doctrine emphasized flexibility, improvisation, and the use of every available resource. Demolitions were common. Bridges, railways, and industrial facilities were destroyed to slow the Allied advance. Snipers, artillery, and ambushes harassed supply convoys. The Wehrmacht's disciplined withdrawal demonstrated that while Hitler's grand strategy was collapsing, the German military machine still retained a measure of lethal capability. Amidst this operational struggle, the human dimension remained central. Civilians returning to liberated towns encountered devastation alongside relief. Many villages had been emptied, their populations displaced, their homes looted or destroyed. Schools, hospitals, and factories had been converted into military facilities. Survivors of Nazi oppression, including forced laborers and prisoners, were now free to return, but they often faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding lives from the ruins of occupation. Letters home, diaries, and newspaper reports from this period capture a dual reality: the exhilaration of freedom intertwined with the sobering awareness of what had been lost. The liberation of Paris also had significant political ramifications. France, occupied for 4 years, now had a symbolic victory to rally national pride. The Free French leadership, long exiled and marginalized, could demonstrate legitimacy and authority. Allies recognized that political as well as military considerations were essential. The war was not just a matter of defeating armies. It was a matter of shaping post-war Europe, securing cooperation among nations, and maintaining morale among populations long subjected to fear and deprivation. Yet beyond the joy and symbolism, a sobering truth lingered: victory could stall. Logistics, supply shortages, and the stubbornness of retreating German forces meant that momentum, once achieved, could be fragile. The Allies had liberated Paris, but they still faced hundreds of miles of contested territory before reaching the German heartland. Every advance required careful planning, coordination among multinational forces, and immense effort from both combatants and support personnel. Victory was real but complex, a mixture of jubilation and exhaustion, opportunity and risk. In this environment, the stage was set for the next phase of the war, one in which Hitler would turn to new forms of desperation, weapons of vengeance aimed not at armies, but at civilians, seeking to break morale when strategy had already failed. The Allies, for their part, had learned a vital lesson. War was not only fought in the fields, but also in supply lines, infrastructure, and the resilience of those who endured its hardships. The liberation of Paris remained a defining moment in history, not just for its spectacle or symbolism, but for the strategic, logistical, and human challenges it highlighted. It was a victory celebrated with parades and cheers, yet tempered by the knowledge that the war was far from over, that the road ahead would be dangerous, and that each step forward demanded courage, ingenuity, and endurance. While Allied forces wrestled with logistics and prepared for the next phase of their European campaign, Adolf Hitler turned to a more insidious strategy: terror. By mid-1944, it had become clear that Germany's conventional armies could no longer stop the Allied advance. The Wehrmacht was depleted, its divisions retreating under the weight of superior numbers and overwhelming air support. Hitler's remaining hope rested not in maneuver or strategy, but in technology, a calculated gamble intended to break civilian morale and sow fear across enemy territories. In June 1944, the first of these weapons struck London, the V-1 flying bomb, nicknamed the Buzz Bomb by British citizens for the distinctive, ominous hum of its pulse-jet engine. Unlike conventional aircraft, these were unmanned, crude in construction yet terrifying in effect. They traveled in waves, sometimes 100 per day, descending on London with deadly accuracy. Entire neighborhoods became targets, and thousands of civilians were killed or wounded in the relentless attacks. The British response was immediate and multifaceted. Anti-aircraft artillery batteries were repositioned around the city, fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept the bombs, and civilian defenses were strengthened with shelters, blackout procedures, and evacuation plans. Ingenious innovations, including radar-guided detection systems and early warning networks, were deployed to minimize casualties. Yet the psychological effect of the V-1 South was profound. Every flight could bring death without warning. Every siren carried the echo of destruction. As summer progressed, Hitler escalated the assault with the V-2 rocket, a weapon far more terrifying than its predecessor. Unlike the slow, buzzing V-1, the V-2 traveled faster than the speed of sound, striking without warning. By the time the first humans saw its shadow or heard its roar, it was already too late. Launched from mobile platforms hidden in forests, fields, and coastal regions of the Netherlands and northern France, the V-2 was unstoppable, unpredictable, and devastating. Cities like London and Antwerp experienced destruction that modern planners had scarcely imagined possible. Thousands of civilians perished, and even more were injured or displaced, as homes and infrastructure were shattered in an instant. Despite these horrors, British morale remained remarkably resilient. The government and the public refused to yield to terror. Children continued to attend school, workers reported for essential jobs, and the population adapted to the constant risk. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and speeches by leaders reinforced the message that fear alone would not determine the outcome of the war. The V weapons, for all their technical sophistication, could not reverse Germany's strategic disadvantage. Allied forces in France and Belgium continued to advance, their momentum unaffected by the attacks on civilians hundreds of miles away. The V-Weapons campaign highlighted a broader theme of the war's final phase: the divergence between technological capability and strategic reality. Germany, unable to stop the Allies on the ground, sought an alternative path to victory through terror. Yet these weapons, while destructive and psychologically impactful, could not substitute for depleted manpower, lost territory, or collapsing logistics. In essence, Hitler's reliance on vengeance weapons was a confession of strategic failure, a last, desperate attempt to assert control in a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. The civilian experience of the attacks was equally revealing. Families huddled in shelters, listening to the terrifying descent of the V1 South or the sudden impact of the V2 South, knowing that survival was as much a matter of luck as preparation. Emergency services, firefighters, and medical teams operated tirelessly, often under fire, to rescue victims and maintain some semblance of order. Entire neighborhoods were transformed into sites of trauma and recovery, their inhabitants forced to adapt to a new, dangerous normal. Personal accounts, diaries, and photographs from this period testified to human resilience in the face of relentless terror. At the operational level, the Allies took steps to neutralize the threat. Bomber Command targeted launch sites in the Netherlands and northern France, often risking severe losses to prevent future attacks. Intelligence agencies tracked the development, deployment, and movement of these weapons, working to anticipate the next strike. The effort required coordination across air, land, and intelligence services, showcasing the complexity of modern warfare, where civilian protection, frontline operations, and technological countermeasures had to be balanced simultaneously. The impact of the V weapons extended beyond immediate destruction. They forced a re-evaluation of military ethics, civilian defense, and strategic prioritization. Hitler had assumed that terror would break the British will to resist. Instead, it steeled it. Londoners continued their routines, sometimes even mocking the bombs with humor, while the military continued to push back with ever-increasing determination. In a paradoxical way, the V weapons campaign revealed the limitations of fear as a tool of war, especially against societies capable of rapid adaptation and coordinated defense. As the months passed, the V1 South and V2S gradually lost effectiveness. Allied forces moved closer to launch sites, overrunning them or forcing their relocation. Technological countermeasures, including more advanced fighter intercepts and improved anti-aircraft tactics, further reduced the threat. By early 1945, the weapons campaign had largely ceased, leaving behind destruction, trauma, and lessons about the interplay of innovation, terror, and strategy in modern conflict. In retrospect, this period underscores the dual nature of warfare in Europe's final months. On one side, Allied armies advanced, liberating territories, sustaining momentum despite logistical challenges, and confronting the horrors of Nazi atrocities. On the other, Hitler's Germany resorted to increasingly desperate and morally reprehensible measures, attempting to leverage technology to offset strategic collapse. The tension between these forces, the march of liberation and the reach of terror, defined the summer and autumn of 1944, shaping the human and military landscape in ways that resonate to this day. Before moving on to the final segment, if you are following this narration, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people see these incredible, real-life stories of World War II history. Understanding the human experiences behind these events ensures that the lessons of courage, resilience, and vigilance are remembered.
By early September 1944, the Allies had reached a critical point in their campaign through Western Europe. After months of grinding advance across France, the liberation of Paris, and overcoming the relentless German resistance in Normandy, the Allied armies stood poised to push deeper into the heart of Germany. Belgium's capital, Brussels, fell to Allied forces without major destruction, and the port city of Antwerp, long sought for its logistical value, was captured largely intact. Antwerp promised a solution to the supply crises that had hindered the Allies for months. For the first time, a major European port was within their grasp. Yet even here, victory revealed its complexities. Antwerp, though captured, was 40 miles inland from the sea and accessible only through the River Scheldt. German forces, understanding the port's strategic importance, had entrenched themselves along the river, mined the waterway, and fortified surrounding towns. The Allies could see the port, but they could not yet use it. The logistical nightmare of supplying vast armies remained unresolved. Trucks continued to shuttle supplies from Normandy through the Red Ball Express, and soldiers faced rationing and uncertainty even as they stood deep in enemy territory. The war had advanced to a point where operational brilliance alone could not guarantee immediate success. Planning, ingenuity, and coordination were still essential. It was in this context that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a bold strategy: Operation Market Garden, a gamble unlike any seen before in the war. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Rather than advancing everywhere along the front, Montgomery proposed a concentrated, rapid push through southern Holland, narrow corridor directly toward Germany. The goal was to bypass heavily fortified German positions along the Siegfried Line, strike a decisive blow deep into enemy territory, and seize key bridges along the way. Airborne troops would leap ahead of the advancing ground forces, capturing bridges at towns such as Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and ultimately allowing armored divisions to race north and secure a path directly to the German border. The plan was, in theory, a brilliant stroke. Speed and concentration could allow the Allies to penetrate German defenses, take control of vital infrastructure, and potentially shorten the war. Yet the risks were immense. The corridor was narrow, exposing advancing troops to potential flanking attacks. Bridges could be destroyed or heavily defended. Coordination between airborne units, armored columns, and infantry would be critical, and even minor delays could doom the operation. Every soldier, plane, and vehicle had to perform flawlessly. Failure was not just possible. It would be catastrophic. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden began. Airborne divisions were dropped behind enemy lines in what was one of the largest airborne operations in history. Paratroopers landed amidst confusion, quickly fighting for control of key positions while awaiting the arrival of advancing ground forces. Courage, improvisation, and determination became daily necessities. Roads and bridges that had once seemed secure were contested fiercely, and German units far from defeated reacted with speed and ferocity. The narrow corridor, initially a strength, became a vulnerability as resistance stiffened. At Arnhem, the culmination of the operation, disaster struck. British paratroopers, despite extraordinary bravery, found themselves isolated and surrounded by German forces, including elite SS units that had regrouped faster than intelligence had predicted. Supply drops were insufficient, communication lines were overrun, and reinforcements could not reach the beleaguered troops in time. The dream of a swift penetration into Germany turned into a desperate struggle to hold positions and minimize casualties. What should have been a decisive leap toward victory became a sobering lesson in the limits of planning, logistics, and the unpredictability of war. Meanwhile, elsewhere along the corridor, Allied forces achieved mixed results. Some bridges were captured intact, towns liberated, and strategic gains realized. Yet the overall operation fell short of its ultimate objective. The Rhine crossings remained contested, and German forces retained the ability to defend their heartland effectively. The gamble had exposed both the daring and the vulnerability of Allied strategy. The lessons learned would influence every subsequent decision in the closing months of the war. Despite the setbacks at Arnhem, the broader campaign in Europe continued to favor the Allies. German resources were stretched to the breaking point. Fuel shortages, manpower deficits, and the relentless pressure of two advancing fronts meant that even successful defensive operations were temporary reprieves. By autumn 1944, the Allies had established a strong presence in Belgium, the southern Netherlands, and northern France. Their armies were poised to push into the Ruhr and beyond, closing the noose around Germany's industrial heartland. The human cost of these operations cannot be overstated. Paratroopers, infantrymen, tank crews, and civilians alike endured extreme hardship. Casualties were significant, and the psychological toll of continuous combat and exposure to German terror weapons weighed heavily on soldiers and civilians. Yet courage, ingenuity, and resilience prevailed. Soldiers adapted to unexpected resistance, medics worked tirelessly under fire, and civilians navigated a landscape of liberated and contested zones with a mixture of fear and hope. These personal stories, though less visible than grand strategic decisions, defined the lived experience of the war's final months. Operation Market Garden, while not fully successful, demonstrated the audacity and resourcefulness that characterized the Allied approach in late 1944. It illustrated the balance between ambition and risk, the interplay of technology, mobility, and human determination, and the sheer complexity of modern warfare. The lessons of Arnhem would shape the planning of subsequent operations, ultimately contributing to the eventual Allied victory in 1945, as the Allies consolidated their positions, secured supply lines, and prepared for the final push into Germany. One reality remained clear. The war was entering its decisive, climactic phase. Every strategic decision, every logistical innovation, every act of courage had consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. Victory was no longer simply about defeating armies, it was about sustaining momentum, ensuring supply, and maintaining the moral and psychological strength to see the campaign through to its conclusion. The narrative of late 1944 in Western Europe, from the liberation of Paris to the challenges of Antwerp and the gamble at Arnhem, is a testament to the complexity, courage, and determination of the Allied forces. It underscores the interplay of ambition, risk, and human resilience, revealing that the path to victory is never straightforward, but is shaped by strategy, ingenuity, and the indomitable will to overcome. The stage was now set for the final months of World War II in Europe, a period that would test the limits of military planning, human endurance, and moral courage, culminating in the ultimate collapse of Hitler's regime and the liberation of an oppressed continent.